Welcome to today's Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here with us because we are embarking on a really deep, investigative deconstruction of a truly fascinating piece of source text. Today, we're analyzing a document that takes a highly critical, completely unflinching look at one of the most universally beloved films in cinematic history. You know the one. We're talking about a movie that didn't just break box office records, it literally defined an entire generation. And for millions of people around the globe, it effectively cemented itself as historical fact in the public consciousness. But the source text we're looking at today argues that what we've been sold as this eternal, beautiful romance is actually something much more manufactured. The author claims that behind all those sweeping, voyeuristic camera angles and the cinematic beautification of those hellish third-class realities, there is a deliberate, highly engineered rewriting of history. Okay, there is a lot to unpack here, so let's dive right into this and see exactly how the source dismantles this absolute cinematic giant. Our explainer today is going to cover 5 key areas. First, the illusion of authenticity. Second, deleting the real hero. Third, inventing a fictional villain. Fourth, fabricating historical narratives. And finally, the motive behind the myth. Did a quest for authenticity actually hide a fabricated history? It's a massive, fascinating question, and it's the central mystery our source material asks us to consider today. The document points out this profound disconnect between what we felt while watching the film and what the historical reality actually was. Basically, the source argues that we have been presented with a Hollywood fairy tale wrapped up and packaged as undeniable historical truth. As we work our way through this analysis today, I really want you to keep this specific disconnect right in the back of your mind. Starting off with Section 1, the illusion of authenticity. So, the source text begins by entirely acknowledging the filmmaker's meticulous, almost obsessive attention to physical detail. I mean, the director went to incredible, truly unprecedented lengths to make everything appear visually authentic. We are talking about exact replicas of Dorian furnishings, tableware that was painstakingly copied down to the original manufacturer's stamp, even the casting of an actor whose face perfectly mirrored the real, historically documented face of the ship's captain. But here is why this extreme physical accuracy actually matters to the source's critique. The author argues this intense focus on physical authenticity was, in reality, a psychological trap. It was used to create a false sense of total historical truth. Think about how this works on a subconscious level, right? When you see a movie where the carpets, the plates, and the faces look 100% real, it completely disarms your skepticism. It makes you subconsciously believe that if the teacups are historically accurate, well, the story being told must be historically accurate too. The source argues this visual perfection effectively set the stage for a much larger deception. Moving on to Section 2, deleting the real hero. The source introduces us to a real, historically documented passenger named Jacob Astor IV. Now, it is absolutely crucial to understand his status on that freezing, bone-chilling night. Astor wasn't just wealthy, he represented the absolute pinnacle of Gilded Age wealth. He was one of the richest men in the entire world, possessing unparalleled influence and power. Imagine the modern equivalent of our world's absolute richest mega-billionaires standing on the deck of that ship. The text specifically emphasizes his massive, almost incomprehensible wealth to set a baseline. It sets up the incredible contrast of what happens next, as the ship begins its final descent and those lifeboats start running disastrously short. According to the historical records cited by our source, Astor actually managed to get his young, pregnant wife safely into a lifeboat. Then he asked a crew member a very simple, quiet question. "Can I join my wife?" The crew member replied, "No. Women and children first." Now, the source stresses that in a moment of unimaginable chaos, a terrifying environment filled with screaming, complete panic, and sheer desperation, where fortunes could theoretically buy survival, Astor didn't argue. He didn't yell, he didn't throw his weight around or leverage his immense, world-bending power. He didn't try to buy his way out with his vast fortune. He just accepted his fate with complete calm. The sequence of events that follows is incredibly powerful, and the source breaks down Astor's final moments into a clear study of quiet heroism. Let's walk through this. Step 1, securing his pregnant wife. Step 2, the denial of his request to join her. Step 3,
The quiet surrender of his own survival. He literally stepped back into the freezing air and wrapped his own coat around a terrified stranger. And step 4, he lit a cigar, stood right where he was, and simply waited to die. I want you to really picture that. Imagine a modern billionaire doing exactly this in a moment of ultimate terror. It is profound, isn't it? The source text explicitly calls this man a real hero, a historically documented hero among the rich, whose actions demonstrated the ultimate form of self-sacrifice. But here is exactly where the source text levels its heaviest critique. 3. That is the number of hours this film runs. Over 3 hours of massive cinematic screen time. And yet, this historically documented hero among the rich, he appears only as a fleeting, almost invisible figure for a mere few seconds. He barely leaves a trace on the entire narrative. The author argues that, for all intents and purposes, the filmmaker deliberately deleted Astor from history. So why? Why would a filmmaker delete a documented real-life hero who absolutely embodied selfless sacrifice? Well, because according to the text, a real, self-sacrificing billionaire would completely destroy the specific narrative the filmmaker wanted to tell.
Which brings us to Section 3, Inventing a Fictional Villain. Enter Cal, the heir to a Pennsylvania steel fortune and the fiancé of our protagonist, Rose. The source is exceptionally clear on this point, and honestly, it's a massive irony. This man is completely fictional. He was pulled entirely out of thin air. Think about the irony here for a second. In a movie that is completely obsessed with authentic teacups, perfectly accurate carpeting, and real historical faces, one of the primary drivers of the entire plot is a complete historical ghost. The author asserts that this character simply didn't exist, but he was placed front and center in the narrative to represent a very specific rich person as villain trope. The source details exactly how this fictional character's villainy is portrayed. He is cowardly. He's ruthless. As the ship is literally tearing apart and sinking, instead of helping anyone, what does he do? He hunts the protagonist, Jack, with a gun, and in his most despicable act, when disaster strikes, he grabs a random, screaming little girl he doesn't even know just so he can secure a seat on a lifeboat. The author argues that these appalling actions were meticulously engineered based on classic Hollywood tropes. I mean, grabbing a child to save yourself, that leaves absolutely no room for nuance or audience sympathy. The source asserts these actions were designed for one reason, and one reason only: to ensure the audience unequivocally, absolutely despised him.
And that leads into Section 4, Fabricating Historical Narratives.
This side-by-side comparison brilliantly illustrates the glaring contradiction at the very heart of the source's argument. On one side, you have the historical reality, the real wealthy hero, John Jacob Astor, who voluntarily gave up his seat, gave away his coat, and stood waiting to die. On the other side, you have the cinematic reality, the fictional wealthy villain, Cal, who is cowardly, ruthless, and fabricated completely out of thin air. The author is highlighting that this wasn't just some accidental oversight. No, it was an active, deliberate swap by the filmmaker. They actively chose fiction over historically documented self-sacrifice. They traded a real hero for an invented villain to prioritize ideology over the historical record.
The source actually takes this analysis even further, looking at the wider, much messier class dynamics presented in the film. According to the text, the ignored historical reality is that human nature is incredibly complex. There were real rich men who behaved nobly and voluntarily gave up their seats. And yes, there were real poor people who, in their sheer terror and panic, fought over lifeboats and violently trampled others. But the author notes that the filmmaker did not film that messy, complex reality. Instead, they completely flattened it into a simple binary fairy tale. The fabricated film reality strictly presents cowardly, evil rich men and self-sacrificing, heroic poor men. The text argues that this is not restoring history at all. It is a direct fabrication of history designed specifically to skew the class dynamics of a real-life tragedy.
Let's look at Section 5, the motive behind the myth.
We've seen what was changed, but now the source unpacks the fascinating psychological chain reaction that explains the why. The author argues the filmmaker needed to strictly control the audience's emotional response, and doing so relied heavily on our complicity as viewers. Think about how you personally felt watching this film. Step 1. The film makes you deeply hate Cal through his completely fabricated villainy. Step 2. Because you inherently hate Cal, you feel that Rose is entirely justified in betraying him. Step 3. This automatically elevates Jack, making the audience feel he is morally superior to his wealthy counterpart. And finally, Step 4. The ultimate goal: manufacturing massive audience applause for a great love story that crosses class boundaries.
The source argues that by making you hate the fictional villain, the film effectively forces you to cheer for the betrayal, proving that this entire emotional journey was highly engineered.
The author defines this entire process as a classic Hollywood manipulation technique. The technique works by presenting a false appearance that closely resembles the truth, specifically to manufacture audience consent for a preferred narrative. And honestly, this matters immensely to us today. Why? Because it shows us just how incredibly susceptible we are to well-crafted narratives. Remember those historically accurate teacups and the exact replicas of the ship's furnishings we talked about earlier? That was the hook. It makes you drop your guard and think you are absorbing pure history. But the source argues that once your guard is down, what you are actually being fed is a carefully fabricated fairy tale. If a filmmaker can wrap a completely fictional ideological agenda inside a historically accurate teacup, what else in our media consumption are we blindly accepting as pure truth?
So, to definitively summarize the primary thesis of our source material today, the text asserts that the filmmaker was more than willing to alter history itself by intentionally deleting real, documented historical heroes and actively inventing completely fictional, cartoonish villains. The film served one specific ideological purpose. According to the source, that purpose was to uniformly celebrate the poor and strictly vilify the rich. The text suggests that the pursuit of a compelling, highly profitable, class-conscious cinematic story ultimately overrode the messy, complex, and documented historical truth of that tragic night. Well, that brings us to the end of our explainer today, but the source actually leaves us with a highly provocative cliffhanger. The author asks, if the villain was entirely invented out of thin air and the real wealthy hero was deliberately deleted from the narrative, what is the final, most cunning lie of this cinematic masterpiece regarding Rose? I'll let you think on that. Keep questioning the narratives presented to you, and we'll see you next time.